It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce the second speaker in our series, Enlarging on the Life of Alfred Russel Wallace. This is a close friend and colleague for many years, Jared Diamond. You probably, or most of you may be aware of him from having read his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. That's really just the tip of the iceberg. He began traveling to really following almost literally in the footsteps of Alfred Russel Wallace, traveling to New Guinea and surrounding islands, studying very similar problems on the role of geography and speciation and other mechanisms of evolution, primarily of birds. His third career began in the late 1980s when he began appearing in the popular press as a public intellectual, writing books like The Third Chimpanzee and Guns, Germs, and Steel, addressing serious questions of human history and culture, as well as biological backgrounds from a historical and a scientific perspective. Today, going to be talking in his second role as a successor, probably the world's foremost successor at this point, to Wallace in exploring the role of geography in speciation, and other details of his career, the many awards that he has received, many prizes are in the back of your schedule of talks. But at this point, I'd like to welcome Jared. He's just returned, I think, from his 28th trip to New Guinea. Going to be talking about biogeography, again, in the Malay Archipelago. Jared.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here today on the occasion of this Wallace Symposium. As for Wallace, when we hear the name Alfred Russel Wallace, we think first of his formulation of evolution. Simultaneously with Darwin, we may also think of Wallace's discoveries in the Amazon, Indonesia, and New Guinea. We think less often about his feats of travel and exploration in areas that are still difficult and dangerous today, and that were far more difficult and dangerous when Wallace was out there in the 1850s. At one point, Wallace was the only European resident on the island of New Guinea, the world's second largest island. I returned 2.5 weeks ago from a month spent studying birds on some of the same islands of the New Guinea region where Wallace had worked in the 1850s. In order to give you a feeling for the dangers that Wallace faced, I'm going to tell you about the dangers that I faced, and then I'll tell you what Wallace wrote about his own experiences of those dangers in his book, Malay Archipelago. And I'll conclude by giving you an example of one of Wallace's general discoveries and an example of one of his specific discoveries. The main dangers in New Guinea today arise from three things: boats and other travel, diseases, and human violence. In all three respects, New Guinea is much safer today than it was in the 1850s, but to quote Donald Rumsfeld, stuff still happens. Let's start with the dangers of boats. Each morning before dawn last month, I set out in a boat from our boat base on one island in order to reach other islands and study birds there. My boat was a modern speedboat with a molded hull and with two big engines of 115 horsepower each. On our boat we had, of course, compass, GPS, and a transmitter, automatic transmitter. Every 2 hours, we transmitted a GPS signal to our boat base and also to Indonesia's National Boat Search and Rescue Service. This automatic transmitted signal gave our location and our condition. We chose each 2 hours between three settings. One setting transmitted, "We're okay." Another setting transmitted, "We're in trouble." And the third setting transmitted, "We're in imminent danger, come pick us up immediately." Sometimes when there were smooth seas with little wind, our boat roared along at 30 knots, and we reached our destination without incident. More often, when we were on the open seas, beyond the protection of islands, waves and winds slammed our boat. At every wave, after the crest of the wave, the boat dropped into a wave trough with a bang. And so it was bang, bang, bang. We held on tight. And at every wave, the boat driver had to adjust the engine speed and the boat angle. Constant effort. The biggest boat problems that we encountered on this trip were on a small uninhabited island called Mesmon Island, where Wallace also had some difficulties that I'm going to mention. Mesmon Island has no safe landing place. It just has beaches, open beaches exposed to the surf. We managed to land on Mesmon through the surf one day, but when we woke up the next morning, we saw that the wind had risen, the seas were getting rougher, the surf was higher, and we realized we had better get out of this island fast before the seas rise even further, or we're not going to be able to get out for a while. And so the boat driver kept the boat waiting in the surf with its engines running, and we swam out all our camping gear, trip after trip, to our boat waiting in the surf. It was hard work, but we ended up not losing anything. But on October 8, while we were in the area, another boat got swamped by surf. It had to signal Indonesian Surf and Rescue, which came out and succeeded in rescuing the passengers, but the boat and the cargo were lost. On an earlier trip, the motor canoe in which I was traveling overturned in the waves. Most of us who had been in that canoe were lucky to be spotted by chance just before sunset, and we were picked up. But the cautious, skilled Indonesian boat captain who piloted me in 1986 and in 1988 was subsequently drowned in a boat accident. To compare then these boat problems today with the problems that Wallace faced, Wallace had no motor. He just had sailboats, often just small sailing canoes. Wallace had no GPS, no emergency signal. There was no Indonesian search and rescue to come out and pick him up when he got into trouble. His book, The Malay Archipelago, describes the difficulties that Wallace encountered on every single long boat trip. Problems with the winds and waves. His sailing boat regularly getting carried in the wrong direction. His crew deserting him. 12 times, 12 tsunami waves lifted his boat, but didn't destroy it. A voyage that took me in my motorized boat half an hour took Wallace 4 days. A journey that took me in my motorized boat overnight took Wallace 4 months. On that Mesmon Island, where I had difficulties getting off the island, Wallace couldn't even land on the island because of the surf. He tried to hold his sailing canoe offshore, but he didn't have engines with which to do it. He dropped an anchor, the anchor dragged, and so Wallace sent 2 of his 4-man crew ashore to cut vines in the jungle with which to make a cable. But while the men were ashore, the boat was carried off by the current. To his horror, Wallace found that he couldn't pick up his men. They were stranded on Mesmon. Wallace was swept off. His 2 stranded men managed to survive on Mesmon Island for a month on roots, flowers, and shellfish, until Wallace, after a first failed attempt to send out a rescue canoe, on the second try did send out another canoe that succeeded in carrying off the 2 stranded men. Wallace in Malay Archipelago described what it felt like to be on these sailing boats. Wallace used the word discomfort, and when it was really bad, he used the term suffering terribly. It must have been actually uninterrupted hell for him to be at sea for 4 days in a small canoe that was pound, pound, pound with every wave, and with every wave threatening to swamp the canoe, and without engines that could point the canoe at each wave. And as we've just heard from Andrew, at the end of Wallace's Amazon trip, a boat fire just destroyed all of the bird and insect collections that he accumulated over the previous year. So problem number one, danger number one in the New Guinea area is boats. The second main danger in the New Guinea area, along with the danger of boats, is disease, particularly the risks of malaria and other fevers, dysentery, and tropical skin ulcers. On each of my trips to New Guinea, I take with me a medicine kit that includes preventatives and cures for malaria and for dysentery and for skin ulcers. Nevertheless, on my first 3 trips to New Guinea, I ended up sick with malaria for a year. I got my first malaria attack on the 5th floor corridor of UCLA Medical School and ended up in UCLA Hospital where I was visited by the dean. And I also ended up sick with dysentery for another year. After that, I became much more careful, and since then, I've never lost more than 1 or 2 days to illness on each of my New Guinea trips. But Wallace's Malay Archipelago repeatedly describes Wallace spending a month sick on every one of his longer trips. The question is not whether he gets sick. Of course he gets sick. The question is whether he's sick and housebound for 3 weeks or a month or 2 months from malaria or dysentery or skin ulcers. Wallace repeatedly describes the painful, crippling skin ulcers that prevented him from walking. For example, he finally gets to New Guinea. His dream birds of paradise are outside his hut, and he's confined to his hut, and he can't walk outside of his hut for a month because his skin has such bad ulcers. Wallace describes being unable to eat solid foods because his mouth was in such bad shape with sores in his gums and teeth. And Wallace describes having nothing to eat anyway except for sago, rice, and whatever birds he had shot. For each of his trips, Wallace lists how many of his assistants and how many of the local villagers died of disease during that particular trip. For example, at one place, Wallace reports 12 people died within the last 5 days. Wallace's assistant, Charles Allen, got sick and eventually had to be evacuated out of Indonesia. Wallace himself returned to England, and he apologized for the delay in writing Malay Archipelago by saying that he'd been in chronic poor health after returning to England. So 2 of the dangers of New Guinea are boats and disease. The third remaining main risk of the New Guinea region is the risk of human violence. Today, both halves into which the island of New Guinea is divided politically are under at least nominal government control. Nevertheless, the risk of violence in New Guinea is still constant. It arises sometimes from misunderstandings with decent local people who haven't understood me and whom I didn't understand, honest miscommunications, or else violence arises from not decent local people who sense a weak potential victim and the possibility of a successful attack, or danger comes from armed police and soldiers themselves. On the average, I encounter 1 or 2 such incidents of potential violence on each of my trips. I personally have gotten out all of those incidents intact, but quite a few, maybe half, of the scientists I know well who have spent much time working in New Guinea have been scarred physically and psychologically by serious violence. But Wallace was mostly working in areas beyond government control. We were at least in areas with nominal government control. And New Guinea was much more violent in the 1850s. Everywhere in New Guinea, Wallace saw slaves who were New Guineans who had been captured in war by other New Guineans. Wallace and the New Guineans with him faced the frequent risk of pirate attacks. And Wallace describes the pirate attacks one after another. In this pirate attack, 1 person got killed. In this attack, 7 people were killed. Some more people got killed over here. Wallace describes in New Guinea seeing the skulls of people killed in war hanging from the house rafters in one village that he visited. Wallace witnessed the beginnings of a war between 2 nearby villages, fought with spears and bows and shields. Local people with knives and spears prepared to attack Wallace's assistant, Charles Allen. Wallace wanted to reach other sites in New Guinea besides his first site, but he decided not to because he learned that sailors often got murdered at other sites that he would have liked to visit, and Wallace concluded that if he visited some other place, he would certainly get killed. So in short, when we admire Wallace's intellectual insights, let's not forget also the constant obstacles to survival that consumed most of his energy to struggle physically against those obstacles, while with whatever energy he had left, he was struggling to understand New Guinea and the biological world intellectually. That then is background for the feeling of what it's like to operate in New Guinea. Let me now use the rest of my time to give you two examples of Wallace's intellectual discoveries in Indonesia and in New Guinea. The first example is Wallace's biggest unique contribution to science, namely his founding the science of biogeography. Long before Wallace and Darwin, it had become obvious to biologists that groups of animal and plant species are not distributed uniformly and homogeneously around the globe. Already beginning with Christopher Columbus's 1492 trip to the New World, Europeans, explorers going overseas, sent back to Europe specimens of the animals and plants that they encountered. And it soon became clear to biologists sitting back home in Europe that other parts of the world were home to species very different from the species of Europe, and also very different from the species of other areas. Today, we take it for granted that kangaroos are unique to Australia and nearby islands. We take it for granted that hummingbirds are unique to the New World and aren't in Europe or Africa or Australia. We take it for granted that giraffes are confined to Africa. All that was learned in the course of European explorers going out over the last 5 centuries. That is, there are geographic differences in animal and plant distributions that cry out for explanation. Biologists of the 1600s and 1700s and early 1800s, going over the floods of specimens that European explorers were sending back from overseas, gradually worked out the basic patterns of biogeography that we know today. Even before Wallace and Darwin, biologists had recognized that the biological world fell into 6 regions that variously merged sharply or gradually into each other. But biologists before Wallace and Darwin believed that living things had been created by God. So how are you to explain that there are roughly 6 sets of species around the world? To the creation scientists of those days, the most straightforward answer was that God, for reasons best known to him or her, had chosen to create 6 different sets of species in 6 different areas. But it wasn't obvious why God would have chosen to do such a thing, or why God divided the world into the particular 6 areas that he did. The next problem with that hypothesis of 6 acts of creation was as follows. When I tell you that the world consists of 6 biogeographic regions, you may say, aha, there are 6 continents: Asia, Europe, Australia, Africa, North America, South America. The 6 biogeographic regions are the 6 continents. No. The 6 biogeographic regions do not correspond to the 6 continents. Yes, there's an Australian biogeographic region, but it consists not just of Australia, but also of New Guinea and other nearby islands. Yes, there's an African biogeographic region, but it stops at the Sahara. And the African biogeographic region doesn't include North Africa, but it does include South Arabia. Why? There is a South American biogeographic region, but it also includes Central America up to Veracruz and the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Mexico. Yes, there's a North American biogeographic region, but it also includes Mexico south to Veracruz and the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. There's a European biogeographic region, but it includes North Africa and all of temperate Asia east to Japan. Yes, there's an Asian biogeographic region, but it only consists of tropical Southeast Asia. So why, creation biologists before Wallace and Darwin had to wonder, did God draw such strange lines between his 6 areas of creation? Why was God so extraordinarily interested not just in beetles, but in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec? Why did God consider that isthmus so important? Both Darwin and Wallace wondered about these facts of biogeography. Darwin's interest in biogeography was narrower and shallower than Wallace's. For Darwin, the facts of biogeography just represented one of the many separate lines of evidence for the facts of evolution. But for Wallace, biogeography was interesting in its own right. Wallace founded the modern science of biogeography, wrote the first book on the subject, and discovered the basic explanations that we accept today. Wallace's interest in biogeography probably owes a lot to the fact that the Malay Archipelago, namely Indonesia and New Guinea, contains the sharpest and most remarkable biogeographic border in the world. In particular, as Wallace crisscrossed in his boat between Indonesian islands, he recognized that Indonesia's sharpest biological divide was between the Indonesian island of Bali, that lies just east of Java, and the Indonesian island of Lombok, that lies a few dozen miles east of Bali. Bali's bird species are typical Asian birds, while Lombok lacks many of those Asian bird groups and instead has groups of Australian birds that don't reach Bali. Wallace recognized similar differences between the next big Indonesian islands north of Bali and Lombok, namely Borneo in the west with its Asian birds, and Sulawesi in the east with more Australian birds. Both Wallace and Darwin came to realize that the explanation of these basic facts of biogeography was not that God had chosen to create 6 independent groups of species in 6 arbitrary places. Why did God, if so, why had God found Lombok and the Isthmus of Tehuantepec such significant dividing lines between his centers of creation? Instead, Wallace and Darwin came to realize independently that the world's biogeographic regions were a natural consequence of the facts of evolution, the dispersal of animals and plants, and the world's geographic barriers to animal and plant dispersal. Wallace worked out the explanation in far more detail than did Darwin. In particular, Wallace realized that the distribution of land and water around the globe has changed during geological history, and that some areas that are barriers to plants and animals today were not barriers in the past, while other areas that are open corridors for plant and animal movement today were barriers in the past. The differences between the birds of Bali and Lombok and of Borneo and Sulawesi gave Wallace some of his decisive insights. The ocean strait between Java and Bali is shallow, but the next strait to the east between Bali and Lombok is deep. Already in Wallace's and Darwin's time, geologists had recognized the evidence for former glaciers and ice ages around the world that would have transferred much water out of the oceans into glaciers on land, lowering sea levels around the world and connecting Java and Bali by draining that shallow sea, and connecting Borneo to Asia. But Lombok and Sulawesi, separated by deep channels from Bali and Borneo, were never connected to Asia. In honor of Wallace, we now refer to the biogeographic line that separates Bali and Borneo from Lombok and Sulawesi as Wallace's line, the most striking biogeographic boundary in the world. Wallace thought that that line marked the border between the Oriental, that's to say the Asian, and the Australian biogeographic regions. We now know that the details are more complicated and more interesting. But it was still Wallace, and to a much lesser extent Darwin, who made the fundamental discovery that distributions of animals and plants around the world can be explained by evolution of species, geographic barriers, the biological history of those species, and the geological history of those barriers. Today, we know far more about biological history and geological history than Wallace and Darwin knew. But the basic framework of biogeography is still the framework that Wallace recognized. He came to appreciate that framework in the course of those uninterrupted hells of sea crossings between islands in canoes and sailing boats during his 8 years in the Malay Archipelago. Now, for the rest of my time, I'd like to talk about an example of one of Wallace's enormous number of small contributions to science. It gets only 1.5 pages in his book, The Malay Archipelago, but it illustrates Wallace's sharp eye and his gift for observation, his gift for asking questions, and the continuing importance of his ideas to biologists today. The example consists of Wallace's discovery of visual mimicry in birds. Visual mimicry means one plant or animal resembling to the eye another plant or animal. Biologists and the general public are familiar with innumerable examples of visual mimicry in butterflies and other insects. For example, non-poisonous butterflies have evolved to mimic in detail in their color patterns poisonous butterflies, like the monarch butterfly, with the result that birds that learn to avoid eating the poisonous butterfly species get deceived into also avoiding eating the non-poisonous butterfly species. And song mimicry is, of course, well attested in birds. Here in Los Angeles, from January onwards, you're going to hear mockingbirds imitating the songs of other bird species, and this is familiar. New Guinea bowerbirds imitate the sounds of trucks slamming on their brakes. Australian lyrebirds imitate the clickety-clack of portable typewriters that they hear being used by field biologists observing the lyrebirds. So that's vocal, sound mimicry in birds. But visual mimicry, that's to say, evolution of mimicking color patterns, plumage patterns, had not been well established in birds as it has been in butterflies. On page 404 of Wallace's The Malay Archipelago, Wallace described how on the Indonesian island of Buru, he discovered a bird called an oriole, the Eurasian oriole family, unrelated to American orioles. Wallace discovered that the oriole of Buru is a striking duplicate in appearance of a completely unrelated bird, a honeyeater called a friarbird. And when Wallace crossed from Buru to the Indonesian island of Seram, the Seram friarbird looks different from the Buru friarbird, and the Seram oriole looks different from the Buru oriole. But the Seram oriole is as identical to the Seram friarbird as the Buru oriole was to the Buru friarbird. So Wallace suggested that orioles had evolved to mimic friarbirds, which are nasty, pugnacious birds, and that orioles gain an advantage through this mimicry because, according to Wallace, crows and hawks that have learned to avoid friarbirds get deceived into also avoiding the weaker and less nasty orioles. But Wallace devoted only 1.5 pages to this observation. He had studied only 2 islands with orioles and friarbirds, and only 2 pairs of model species and mimic species. Wallace didn't actually measure hawks avoiding orioles, and so ornithologists for the next century forgot or dismissed Wallace's claim to have discovered visual mimicry in birds. Subsequent collectors, though, collected friarbirds and orioles on other Indonesian and New Guinea islands. When I began studying birds in New Guinea in 1964, I hadn't read Wallace's description of visual mimicry. And New Guinea has an oriole and friarbird. I got disgusted with myself when I found that I was having trouble distinguishing the New Guinea oriole from the New Guinea friarbird. And I thought I shouldn't be having any trouble because these are birds in such different families. Eventually, I looked at orioles and friarbirds on other Indonesian islands. And whereas Wallace had done his comparison with 2 islands, I found that there were 8 different species of friarbirds scattered over Indonesian and New Guinea islands, and there were 8 different species of orioles scattered over these islands. The Firebirds vary in plumage from island to island, and so do the orioles. On one island, the Firebird has a bare black face patch. On another island, the Firebird has two bare black face patches. On another island, the Firebird has some yellow. On another, he's got olive. On another, he's got gray. On another, it's all brown. And the oriole also varies in the same way, but varies in parallel, such that on each island, the oriole looks so similar to the Firebird that they're essentially impossible to distinguish in the field. Evidently, Wallace really was right about this being a case of mimicry, with the model, the Firebird, and the mimic, the oriole, having evolved parallel geographic variation. In the last 50 years, to broaden this example of Wallace, many other such examples of mimicry in birds have become appreciated. Those of you who are bird watchers will think of the confusing resemblance between the various only distantly related so-called Kiskadee flycatchers of Central and South America. Interest in this phenomenon of visual mimicry in birds exploded 10 years ago with a remarkable discovery about the downy woodpecker and the hairy woodpecker in North America. Those of you who are bird watchers know that the downy and hairy woodpecker are very similar to each other. Plumage pattern essentially the same. They differ somewhat in size and in bill size, but downy and hairy woodpeckers are really hard to tell apart. And nobody thought that this was particularly interesting because it was thought that downy and hairy woodpeckers are closely related to each other, so this similarity is just because of close relationship and recent ancestry. Well, the bombshell 10 years ago was DNA studies that showed that downy and hairy woodpeckers, while they're both in the same family woodpeckers in the same genus, they're distant relatives of each other. Their resemblance is not due to close relationship. They don't have a close relationship. Their resemblance must instead reflect mimicry rather than close relationship. And since that bombshell of the downy and hairy woodpecker, there have now been more and more discoveries of mimicry between somewhat related bird species, like the downy and hairy woodpecker, and not just between unrelated species like the Firebirds and orioles discovered by Wallace. This area involves big unanswered questions, of which the biggest question is, what really is the advantage that the bird mimic gains from mimicking the bird model? Are hawks really afraid to attack the mimic, as Wallace suggested? Or could it instead be that the model itself, such as the Firebird, is afraid to attack the mimic, such as the oriole, mistaking it for a nasty Firebird? Or is it the case that other small birds are afraid of the mimic, the oriole, because it looks like a nasty Firebird? Or could we be wrong about who is the mimic and who is the model? Could it be the Firebird that for some reason is mimicking the oriole? This is now a hot area of research in bird evolution and bird behavior. I mentioned this example just to illustrate that Alfred Russel Wallace didn't just co-found our understanding of evolution along with Darwin. And he didn't just establish the science of biogeography. Instead, we still read Wallace's book, The Malay Archipelago, with pleasure and with profit today because that book and Wallace's other writings provide hundreds of examples of brief, shrewd observations, to each of which Wallace devoted only a paragraph or a page, but which have been stimulating biologists ever since. In short, those stories with which I began my talk illustrate how Wallace persevered for years under conditions that often approximated uninterrupted hell. These two biological examples with which I've concluded, the examples of the world's biogeographic regions and of visual mimicry, illustrate why we are commemorating Wallace today as a great scientist as well as a great explorer. Thank you.